Dark Souls is an incredibly complicated franchise. Not in the way it plays, but in the way any one person will understand the stories presented to you, and sometimes the stories are left up to each individual to formulate for themselves. But surprisingly, there is one thing that can be found in the gothic ashes of any rendition of the flame: love. Not the romantic love we see in traditional storytelling, but the many, many kinds of love, big or small, that hold the broken flames together and sometimes tear it apart. The type of love that remains within Dark Souls is somewhere between complicated and indescribable, but not quite impossible. And while I do believe that love does persist in Dark Souls, I think there is something slightly beyond it, something that is just as complicated as the cycle of the flame itself. There is a word in the Korean language called jong. Jong can't really be translated into English, and it isn't love either, as that would be sarang, which literally means love of both the emotion and object kind. However, for the sake of the video, I might refer to jong as bond, but do note that it isn't a direct translation, as jong cannot be translated. Tong is a profound emotional bond that develops between people, places, or even objects through shared experience, and tong grows over time. Unlike Western romantic love, which is often individualistic and tends to be surface level, tong is interdependent and persists even when it necessarily shouldn't. Tong is that unspoken bond that makes you care for someone you fought with for years. The attachment to a childhood home, the weight in your chest when looking at your pet getting on in age. Tong isn't just positive, nor is it only negative. It simply is as it's meant to be. Tong exists not within one person, but between people, which ultimately implies Tong transcends space, being completely endless, existing beyond time itself, something that Dark Souls puts into play in many aspects, such as the abyss, for example. With this understanding, although it is very brief, From Software has placed the essence of Zhong, even at a minimum, more concretely than many Western narratives ever could. The curse of undeath erases memory and drives one to madness. Kingdoms are created by the flame only to collapse within the same cycle, but I think that the bonds that persist in Dark Souls are those defined by Zhong, unspoken but understood and enduring beyond rationality, which often leads them to be painful in some aspects. The dark sign is the curse of undeath that makes death temporary but slowly erodes memory and humanity as a result. Because of the dark sign, something like Zhong becomes more precious and more dangerous than it does in our modern age. However, everything meaningful also endures. As I mentioned before, Tong is neither good or bad, and it often develops through shared suffering as much as shared joy. There's actually a more specific word for this in Korean called mienjong. Make no mistake, this is still the exact same zong, but honed into just one part of its complicated nature. The best way to describe it in English is the relationship akin to Tom and Jerry, a pair that didn't match all too well at the start, but after spending so much time together, even if it was out of spite, it appears the two of them are quite well suited to a friendship after all. Dark Souls absolutely has Myeonjong. We meet characters who are hostile at a glance, or notably miserable, which implies they aren't too fun to be around, but through repeated and consistent encounters, and importantly through the shared struggle of being hollow or trying to define who we actually are, we, as the player, develop bonds with them even if we do not think so. It doesn't ask whether a relationship is good for you, because it doesn't care. It simply persists because that is the way the flame perceived it to be so. Do or do not accept it. Everything you do is up to you, and only you can decide what to do with the relationships you come across. But just know, Zhong will be there whether you like it or not. For example, there's one relationship in Dark Souls that every single player, without a doubt, has had, but few can put a name to it. It's the bond between you and your weapon of choice. Some will find it early. Maybe it's the broken straight-sword that is with you when you're at your beginnings in the undead asylum. Or it's just a standard sword, scythe, talisman, twin sword, or a shield transposed from the soul of any one god felled by your hand. At first, it's just a weapon, as per its nature. But then you invest the time it takes to upgrade it. You spend your precious time looking for the sometimes annoying to obtain finite resources of a dying world, just to make that weapon truly one of a kind. As the flame continues to fade, you learn the range of your weapon of choice, the exact number of frames per attack, how many attacks it takes to stagger larger targets, and eventually, you never unequip it, as you know this weapon far too well to let it sit idle. It becomes an extension of your very hollow soul, allowing you to kill everything around you with an ease that is the reward of your efforts. In a Dark Souls setting, Zong can be that of your sword, which has never failed you, even when it might have at first in its weaker state. The most explicit example, I suppose, would be the Storm Ruler, Yorm's greatsword in Dark Souls 3. It exists for only one purpose: to kill Yorm. By all rational metrics, the Storm Ruler is a completely useless weapon. It's heavy, it's slow-ish, and ineffective against any other enemy that isn't Yorm. But players who have fought alongside Sigurd, who have heard him call Yorm,
old friend,
might not be able to discard the Storm Ruler even after Yorm's death. Some players keep it in their inventory. Some keep it as their secondary armament long after the giant is dead. The Storm Ruler and your somewhat feelings towards it is also Chong, a bond between two friends that the player has inherited, a promise that outlasts its fulfillment. The final boss of Dark Souls 3, the Soul of Cinder, wields the Firelink Sword, a somewhat amalgamation of every bonfire to have ever existed, whilst the suit of armor it puppets is a gathering of every unfortunate soul bound to the bonfire. There is a profound level of Zong within the Soul of Cinder, the sword that will outlast its wielder, carrying the memory into new hands, which carry the sword into new ages. The Firelink Sword transcends Zong across time, connecting the flame and the undead in an unbroken chain of care and violence. In a world where the constant weight of living is driving hollows to insanity, where memory fades and kingdoms are fated to collapse, the bond between the undead and their weapon is perhaps the one and only thing that will actually remain. It is irrational, but it simply is. It is Zong. And when you link the fire, or let it fade, or usurp it for yourself, that shameless coiled sword will await you, planted firmly in the ashes and set itself alight, just to provide a moment of rest as the idea of what it means to be chosen surrounds you. One of the most emotionally devastating relationships in Dark Souls is that between the Abyss Walker Artorias and his wolf companion, Sif. When we encounter Sif in the base game, she's guarding Artorias' grave in the Darkroot Garden, and we're led to believe her only purpose was to grant the player the Covenant of Artorias, a ring that allows one to walk the Abyss and fight the Four Kings. Artorias, of course, was sent to Ulasil by a then secretly frightened Gwyn to stop the spread of the Abyss under the idea that the Abyss was just a minor issue. But, most likely as Gwyn intended, Artorias was swiftly eaten by the Abyss, which ended up containing it to a certain degree. Before he fell completely, Artorias left his great shield to Sif. Whilst this is absolutely love, it is also Zong, prioritizing a bond over self-preservation where the boundary between self and other in question becomes permeable to a degree in which you find yourself willing to do extreme things for them. The player can save Sif in the DLC and bring her along to fight Manus. If we do this, we get a special cutscene in the base game in where Sif recognizes us, although she does hesitate knowing that she owes us the Covenant of Artorias out of a somewhat debt. Despite this, Sif ultimately aligns herself with Artorias, fulfilling a much greater debt, one that allowed her to survive, even if it meant she wouldn't actually escape the chasm. Zhong can be greater between different pairs, even if one subject remains the same. Sif doesn't want to fight us. She remembers we saved her, she knows this to be fact. But the bond forged through shared battles that we don't even know of, and a final sacrifice to prevent a worse fate, compels Sif to defend the very thing that destroyed Artorias, because Artorias is the Abyss. Sif makes a choice to believe in persistence beyond reason. If we as the player end up walking the Abyss, what does that mean for Artorias? Nothing in the Abyss truly dies, for it is just as infinite as the flame. So if we seal it away to the furthest reaches, what happens to any remnant of Artorias? Sif knows the Abyss consumes, but since it consumes and doesn't kill, doesn't that mean Artorias lives, after all? That is the Zhong Sif is bound to. Zhong, the beautiful half, exists too, though it's rarer and much more fragile. The Fair Lady and Engi both love and Zhong simultaneously. The Fair Lady is blind, confined, incredibly weak, and literally on her deathbed, yet she speaks, if you have the old witch's ring, to the player with genuine affection, believing us to be her sister, Quaylag.
Quaylag, my dear sister.
If you join the Chaos Servant Covenant and offer humanity to ease the Fair Lady's suffering, you are actively participating in Zhong, a beautiful bond that asks for absolutely nothing but the relief of another's pain. And as a fortunate upside to this Zhong, traversal of Izalith becomes much easier. Both feelings will always coexist, intertwined. The beautiful and ugly are inseparable. Even the environment participates in this duality, I suppose. Blighttown is universally one of the more arduous areas in the franchise, but you will often find players who speak of it with a strange fondness. Something along the lines of, I hated it, but it stands to be the best miserable area in a Souls game type of example. This is also Zhong, the accumulated experience of struggle that becomes attachment. The frustration has seeped into familiarity, the ugly into the tolerated. So, by now, I'm sure you understand that Chong is not defined by either moral side. The bond between Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, and his son Gwendolyn, the Dark Sun, is another example of how Zhong can become a cage rather than a connection. Gwendolyn was famously raised as a daughter despite being male because Gwyn associated the moon with femininity, with Dark Souls 3 stating that Gwendolyn was said to behave like a sullen, brooding goddess. Gwendolyn's entire identity was shaped by his father's desires, but still, Gwendolyn's loyalty to his father is just as famous as his upbringing. Gwendolyn maintains the illusion of sunlight in Honor Londo for centuries, even as his entire family forsook it. With this understanding, Chong gets twisted into a type of obsession. Gwendolyn remains bound to his father's vision, even when that vision actively denies the Dark Sun's existence, harming him in the long run. In Dark Souls 3, Aldrich consumes Gwendolyn, and we end up fighting a version of Aldrich whom is actively swallowing Gwendolyn in real time. The Zhong that should have protected Gwendolyn, his connection to Honor Londo, and really the only reason Honor Londo was able to persevere, his duty to his family, instead made him insanely vulnerable. Gwendolyn was so committed to maintaining what Gwyn began that he couldn't flee when danger came because he had been actively weakened by his father in the denial of allowing his masculine side to simply be, meaning Gwendolyn never learnt how to properly defend himself outside of petty range. A god, devoured by something deeper than the abyss in the same city Gwyn founded to provide safe haven from and live in ignorance of it. That is the darker side of Zhong, when the bond becomes more important than one's survival. when loyalty prevents necessary change through blinding. Gwendolyn's story warns that Zhong without healthy boundaries can lead to consumption, literal in Gwendolyn's case. But despite all of this, Gwendolyn did not die in vain. He left Irithyll behind him, his true self safely hidden from the sun entirely, and in both Ulusil and the Ring City, it's blindingly clear that Gwendolyn was well loved at a time when he could not love himself. The very same Zhong that was rotting Gwendolyn from the inside bound him to the people, the true pitiful people of both Lordran and Lothric, giving them a god that they, as futile beings, needed. A rare thing found in the flame, and a rarer Zhong even still. Looking across all three Dark Souls games through the lens of a different culture may put a name to an emotion you might have felt previously but could never name in the West. I have been using the term bond when not using Zhong, but even then, as I said earlier on in the video, that really isn't the correct word. It simply is just the closest one to it in an English language. Zhong persists beyond rational hope. And finally, Zhong is a collective rather than individualistic. Since Korea is a collectivist society, we often means I bounded by Zhong to you, whereas in English, we just represents any multiple I's. In fact, we in Korean is uri, meaning ours or my, depending on the usage. There is no we, just uri. Just the act of Zhong forming us together. Dark Souls characters don't seek self-actualization. They seek connection at the end of the world, even when that connection sometimes might mean sacrifice. The Uri of Artorias and Sif, the Uri of you and your favorite weapon, the Uri of Gwyn and his youngest son. These are collective identities that transcend individual survival in many ways of both the good and bad pretext. The curse of undeath tries to sever Zhong by erasing memory. The fading fire tries to demolish Zhong by ending the cycle. But as long as there is fire, there will always be a firekeeper to tend to it, keeping Zhong alive even if one singular connection. There is Uri between the firekeeper and the fire. No we, just ours.
Ashen One, hearest thou my voice still?
Until next time, learn that if there is something you can't quite name, it's probably because you're looking for it in the wrong language.
Don't you dare let yourself go hollow, lest my time spent on you be wasted.